Welcome back to part 2 of our brief look at the profound stages of faith that Janet Hagberg and Robert Guelich look at in their seminal book called The Critical Journey, Stages in the Life of Faith. So our first video looked at a journey of faith from its first enthusiastic beginnings right up until it appears to be at the brink of a crash, maybe for good and ever. Let's pick up our journey right at that point of high drama. So their stage 4 they call the journey inward. And they tell us that this move from stage 3 to 4 is most likely precipitated by a crisis in our life or our faith. That crisis makes many of our former truths and answers inadequate or inappropriate for the next phase in the journey. They tell us that it would be great to think that most priests, ministers, and other spiritual leaders could be our guides through stage 4. But the sad truth is that many of those leaders haven't themselves been led through this stage and haven't allowed themselves to question deeply or to become whole. So many of those to whom we often look most naturally for help turn out to be inadequate guides for this part of the journey. At this stage, our journey is intensely personal. It's difficult to share with others, which makes it hard to develop any sense of belonging. Possible scriptural examples for them are Jesus' friend Peter. So the Peter who emerged after Easter to lead the church after Pentecost was a really different Peter from the man for whom the cock had crowed as he betrayed Jesus. Or Elijah, who went from being God's great representative on earth to fleeing for his life and wondering what on earth just happened. To get to the stage of productive living, that they're stage 3, they tell us we learn things like obedience and innocence and belonging and being in the center. But at this stage, all we can say is that we're on the trail of a direction so vague and unclear that it's frightening. We know that we're no longer looking for an answer, though, which I think is a fascinating observation. They tell us when things go well at this stage, we experience a new kind of yielding. We relinquish our ego. Whereas before, we were more confident in ourselves. Now we're becoming deeply confident in God to take care of us totally. Paradox is the key. What's true is also false. That is, our church or our family represented God, but it didn't represent God. It can be an uncomfortable stage. Some people call it, they tell us, the dark night of the soul. It's a time of feeling withered and alone, of searching and not finding, or grieving and feeling a loss. We simply can't go through this wall that we hit here while working 60 hours a week. We need to set aside time for solitude, time to walk, to listen to God's voice, to think, to feel, to reflect. Hagberg and Guelich help us regroup here with some summary thoughts, telling us that in the first 3 stages, our faith or our spirituality takes its expression most frequently in ways that are prescribed by external standards, whether by the church, a spiritual leader, a book, or a set of principles. But stages 4 through 6 represent a difficult personal transformation and a re-emerging that require a rediscovery on a different level of what faith and spirituality are all about. These, they tell us, are inner healing stages, both spiritually and psychologically, for which the journey can't be prescribed. Their stage 5 they call the journey outward. So in the first 3 stages, whatever problems we might discover in ourselves, whatever brokenness or maybe sin, we feel confident there's a plan out there for us to get past it. There's some wise person who's going to guide us through it. We're going to fix it. In stage 4, we have given that up. At stage 4, we meet ourselves, they tell us. We discover forgiveness, we experience healing. Yet the healing process and integration have to continue. At stage 5, we grow into the full awareness that God truly loves us, even though we're never fully whole. So having come through this wall, this barrier in the 4th stage that we seemingly can't get past, we realize, you know what? We can be useful in a different way than we were in stage 3, their productive life. Hagberg and Guelich tell us that here we experience a humor, cosmic and divine, that causes us to chuckle at things that might not have seemed funny before. We come to realize that God's purpose corresponds with our own deep longing and purpose that we weren't yet aware of, but it was there all along. I think back to earlier in my marriage where my wife and I would spend time trying to figure out what our callings might be. But here, we are told, we begin to experience God's choices for us as our calling. We're not in charge. We don't do the planning. So eventually, at this point, we're told we feel the striving cease, and we're not sure when it happened. We develop a deep calm or a stillness. We've learned what keeps us connected to God, and we've developed disciplines that promote our inner calm and clarity. And now we live out of our center. We're natural healers, and we're clear about our calling. And we've let go of our anger and grief over past wounds. Their stage 6, they call the life of love. This might correspond to what the Desert Fathers and Mothers call being pure of heart and so seeing God, or what some of them begin to call union with God. Here, Hagberg and Guelich tell us, we give our all without feeling that it means surrender or sacrifice. So in earlier stages, when we had a challenge in life, maybe some leader might tell us we just need to trust God, and so we take that as the challenge. We do our best to work up the trust we're going to need. I will trust God. But here we find that we actually just do seem to trust God rather than working at it. They tell us it's not that we don't appreciate nice things here, like beauty, health, and happiness. We do. But we're not attached to nice things or to things in general. We travel light. Jesus' itinerant style of life reflected his detachment from earthly possessions. So he was often the guest of honor in a home or at a dinner. And he'd learned that God's call to him meant freedom from things and from stress. When a man asked him what he needed to do to know life, Jesus told him, sell his possessions, give the proceeds to the poor, become one of his disciples. Yet, we're told, we never find Jesus anywhere in the Gospels fretting over food, clothing, or shelter. Rather, we hear him in the Sermon on the Mount exhorting his disciples to seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, instead of worrying about food, drink, clothing, or what's coming tomorrow. In this sixth stage, we find we define ourselves less than we did even in the fifth stage. This stage represents not our work, our calling, our life, we're told, but it's the life we live in God. It's all about the transcendent life we live beyond ourselves. People on this stage will probably be uninterested in things like personality profiles or tests to discover their gifts, not because they're not self-reflective, but because they know themselves well now and aren't interested in being validated or recognized. Their looks at stages 5 and 6, to me, seem a little bit less developed than their looks at stages 1 through 4, maybe because they've spent less time in those stages. That said, many, maybe most, Christian mystics from throughout the centuries talk mostly about their stage 6, about complete union with God. And that can feel like distant and inaccessible. It might not be clear how useful this would be to most people who are neither cloistered nor famous spiritual geniuses. But maybe Hagberg and Guelich offer us help to see this as just one more stage to be aware of, that God might show us glimpses of as we do our best to chart our course this direction and see where it takes us. Okay, let's take a look at Hagberg and Guelich's summary of what their stages of faith offer us. Here's what they tell us. They say that their stage 1, the recognition of God, humbles us. Their stage 2, the life of discipleship, grounds us. Their stage 3, the productive life, rewards and exalts us. Their stage 4, the inward journey, unsettles us. The wall unmasks us. Their stage 5, the journey outward, transforms us. And their stage 6, the life of love, transcends us. The critical journey is by no means the only way to look at the spectrum of a life of faith. But I hope you've nonetheless found their take on this journey helpful and comforting and motivating.